And we're back. So we're talking about visual signifiers, the actual qualities and details that you present to your viewers, who then put them all together in like the blink of an eye to figure out what your images are about, what's happening in them, what they feel like, what the individual parts mean, and eventually what the whole image means. In something like this, a constructed, man-made object, whether a part looks like injection molded plastic or machined metal, that's important because each of those speaks a slightly different visual language, and so they each convey different things to your viewer. When they see the telltale signs of injection molded plastic, they probably don't consciously say, "Oh, I recognize that semi-translucent texture and the ragged edges where the mold had seams." But they will quickly put the details together without necessarily realizing it, and maybe get the feeling that it's kind of a cheap item for mass consumption. They might intuit its lack of quality or its disposable nature. And inevitably then, it more subconsciously conveys all sorts of ideas, maybe about carelessness or low culture, consumerism, or children's toys. I mean, you name it. It depends in part on who's looking. People have all sorts of associations to these kinds of things, and if you're trying to convey something specific, you need to be aware of that and try your best to control for it. The individual signifiers here, like the reflections that tell you it's metal and the little signs of wear and tear on that metal, and bigger stuff like the geometric spiral and the hexagonal head designed for your wrench to hold it, all these things tell you it's a bolt, and you didn't have to consciously think about it. Those qualities are visual signifiers, and you added them all together in your head to equal metal bolt. So then if we take the signifiers of this bolt and add them to a larger collection of other related signifiers like this, you may not know exactly what it is, but you recognize the world it comes from. It's clearly a machine of some sort. Metal, facets, milling, assemblies, joints, bolts. You know, this is speaking the language of a certain kind of human-designed machine. As is this, although you'll notice, of course, some of the qualities are slightly different, and they tell you something slightly different, namely that it's an older machine, older technology from a different era. Big things like this spinny bit with the balls, and this huge spoked wheel, and this giant piston for sure. So many bits and bobs here are telling you that, but then each is composed of smaller details that communicate things about them, like the flared shape on this knob, or these chunky maker labels made out of pressed metal, and the typography of them, and how the letter forms themselves are raised and buffed for brightness, and stuff like the oxidation of the surface treatment on this cylinder. They're all telling you things that you recognize pretty much instantly. This copper tubing, the little bronze bits. I mean, you could call out all these little signs for hours. And those signs go all the way from the big stuff right down to the subtlest details. It's the same in both of these cases. Most of their qualities are pretty similar, but they're speaking just a slightly different dialect, if you will. Although you still know basically what each of them is. And again, you know that whether you know exactly what either of these specific things are or not. You recognize the component parts and their distinct qualities, and you can put together a pretty general understanding in about a half a second. The same way you know fundamentally what this is. Now, bear with me here. I know this seems like preschool material. Part of the point is that there are enough of the signifiers of flower here that you don't also need the stems and the leaves and the dirt and the air and the bees and on to get that it's a flower. So you can see that abstraction works in part because you can identify the signifiers of things without them being presented exactly as you might expect. It's the reason you can pull references to so many things out of this. From the shapes, the textures, the colors, the iconography, and so forth. Because each of these various visual qualities are simple indicators that your brain knows from experience and can identify what they mean together, even when they've been manipulated to a degree. And as the term visual language implies, those signifiers can be thought of like the letters of a gigantic alphabet that can come together to form words, and many of those words together compose statements belonging to specific languages. And ideally, those are statements that aren't completely obvious or unthoughtful or seemingly complex, but with no discernible logic. Ideally, they mean compelling things together. Aw, that's sweet. Or maybe it's creepy. I don't know. It's still a pretty generic statement. See, what did I tell you? You thought it was cute, and now you got to go get a restraining order against someone. Various objects or elements can share some signifiers, like various languages can share words. And you know this language is different than this one without having to think about it so much, if at all, really. As a viewer, you know it when you see it. But the real point is that as an artist, at the very least, you have to be conscious of what languages you're speaking, so you know what you're saying to your audience. And sometimes that means being able to understand a language at the level of its grammar and its words, and sometimes maybe even down to its basic alphabet if it's a language you're not as familiar with. Speaking the language of camera lens means using these sorts of textures and colors and line qualities, put together into a variety of these kinds of elements, and generally composing these elements in this particular way. Letters, words, full-on sentences. And then viewers can fairly well intuit camera lens. And that's really powerful because once you start getting a feel for what makes up a language and how it's structured, you can change the letters or words or grammar of it to remix and play with that language. Up to a point, of course. Mess with the language enough and it may become unrecognizable, or it might reference something you didn't mean. But if you're conscious of it, you can use it in new ways to say something your viewers can relate to but have never quite seen. Visually speaking, you can show them abstractions of things they recognize and introduce new ideas as a result, which is pretty cool. Now, what's complicating for us is that you and I are both viewers and artists. As viewers, we can look at this and go, oh, I'm pretty sure that's Chinese calligraphy. Again, you know it when you see it. But as an artist, now try to sit in front of a blank piece of paper and brush out some characters in Mandarin. Yeah, not easy, let alone writing like a whole short story that way. Likewise, recognizing a face and drawing a face from memory are two utterly different activities, even if our minds make it easy to imagine doing the latter. We have a real blind spot in our brains that convinces us it would just be so easy. But you ever see something cool and go, hot damn, I want to make that too? And then you try it and your version of it sucks. Absolute balls. Yeah, of course you have. Everyone has. That's due in part to the fact that everyone has this cognitive blind spot. In reality, of course, we can't do a very good job of making it until we really understand what it is that we're making. And understanding this simple idea about the range of signifiers that are present in an image, or anything you're looking at and identifying for that matter, goes a long way towards setting yourself up to understand and make your own more interesting version of it. Or, as ever, to select just some of the important signifiers and combine them with something else to create something entirely new. To start abstracting things by really understanding their structure and the component parts that go into it, and the qualities that make up those parts, and then wielding all those signifying aspects however you want. In a situation like this, it's incredibly useful to know how to make something that looks super durable and built for outdoor environments, or looks like more intricate and fragile computer parts. That it references or looks like one kind of technology or another, because if you're going to mix computer parts and cameras, it helps to have a good grip on how they each look and why, so that your audience can read something specific in what you show them. And of course, that takes looking at and finding out about a lot of stuff and why that stuff looks the way it does. What makes for floweriness or camera lensness? What is it about someone else's work that's really inspiring to you that you might want to borrow from? It takes learning to speak those languages, and whether that means referencing some aspect of 70s psychedelia or implying that some friends are made of gummy candy, it really takes digging in with this critical eye to understand it, and then creating your own reference libraries so you can always go back and look at the particulars of things. In episode 7, Style and Strategy, we talked about this idea of a visual library. On the one hand, it's a collection of mental references you're always developing and adding on to just by looking at the world with an analytical eye. And on the other, it's an actual collection of images that you build and organize for yourself to refer back to when you need it. Now, I'm still building my visual library for this particular kind of thing, and I'm still learning where to find good reference material for it, which is partly why my imaginary security cam is kind of a mishmash of signifiers. There's some guesswork and mixed references here, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because clearly I wasn't aiming for an exact replica. I wanted a mix of references. But I'll admit, I was kind of winging it. I think I definitely nailed the camera lens part of it though. I knew what to look for, and for that part I drew heavily from this single reference. I still did my own remix of what I thought some of the important signifiers of this were. But that's where the real power is, in being able to adapt and remix the right signifiers to make new, interesting stuff that people still understand. And of course, that applies to all things, not just my nerdy fascination with hard surface machinery. It applies to everything in the frame. We have this one element, and it vaguely resembles a security camera. Security cameras don't have anywhere near this much exposed detail. Nor do they have Illuminati references or red in the lens. But it still reads as security camera-ish through a combination of the forms and details, the signifiers I've pulled from reference. So already by itself, this tells part of the story. But I thought it needed some context to help fill out that story. A sense of place maybe, some atmosphere. And I like this steam or mist for that reason. I had actually originally thought it would be cool if it were embedded in a really thick fog. But treating this more like steam evoked the idea of a dank, back alley environment, and that really appealed to me. Maybe it's just a little industrial or even cyberpunk. So to support that idea, I started building out this kind of back alley or factory-style piping as a background. It doesn't need to be too specifically detailed since I plan on blurring it out a little and mostly covering it with steam, but I'm definitely trying to build it with some internal logic so that it does have that feel of organized, purposeful pipework and wiring. I'm also trying to keep the color palette and the values subdued so that it doesn't steal too much attention from the foreground, and keeping the direction of these predominant shapes generally running a slightly different direction than the lines in our security camera so it doesn't confuse that silhouette. The silhouette of the camera in this dark environment is a pretty important read. So we just want to make sure wherever we can that the edges of that silhouette aren't confused with anything, that they're delineated at least enough to be readable. Having lines in the background running parallel to that edge would tend to confuse it with them a bit. Kind of like how camouflage works. Having their direction contrast its direction, of course, helps it stand out and read a little better. But even more so, setting the dark edge against the brighter values of the steam really gives it something to contrast against. Otherwise, we'd have almost black on black. I'm bringing up the edges on these forms for the exact same reason. Just increasing the value contrast alone makes these lines readable. You know, generally it's really the combination of little strategic uses of the contrast that helps you get where you need to go. And that's true here. But I think in this case in particular, value is something that has to get massaged a lot. Like a lot. We've got a dark central object against a dark background. Most of the grays are between 10 and 15% brightness. The steam is bright by contrast, but it's still less than 50% white. Even the hottest spots on this metal don't hit 90%. So for the majority of the image, we're dealing with less than a 15% range in values. And that's not a problem in and of itself. It might be just fine in some cases. But again, it's important for this dark thing to read against all these other dark things. So there's just some basic work setting darker shapes up against slightly brighter ones to delineate the edges and make those shapes read. It's the same simple tactic used again and again. I want a little more depth too. We've got some stuff in the background and in the mid to foreground, but how about just a little indication of something even closer than that? Nothing crazy. I had this quick idea about some thin suspension wires holding this thing up, maybe extending out from the corners of this camera body. So I thought I'd build out these little clips or mounting brackets real quick. Of course, real quick turned into like 2 hours, but you know, whatevs. Unfortunately, it's terminally difficult to arrange something for a specific camera angle in Fusion 360. It's just not meant for that sort of thing. And I'd like to have been able to get these wires coming straighter into the frame for deeper perspective, but I started spewing a stream of bad words trying to make that happen and just settled on this. And that still helps a little. with some more balancing out of the values to highlight some edges and help that background recede, and then popping in some more definite light sources, I thought this had gone about as far as I wanted to take it. There were some thoughts about adding in something like snow or rain, or putting condensation on the camera to accentuate the humidity for an even more developed story of this dank environment. But I don't actually have more advanced texturing tools or renderers, so maybe you can see for yourself where you'd add or take away or adjust the details to tell some other version of this story. Looking at it now, I think a basic thing I'd do would be to simply render this at an up angle, as though this camera is looming over its environment and over the viewer. That shift in perspective would make the camera seem like it's in more of a position of power, which I think would definitely benefit this particular portrayal of surveillance. Although I made the mistake of modeling the whole thing just to be seen from this angle. So that'd be modeling the entire underside of this camera, moving a bunch of things around, relighting it, building out more of the background, repainting all these highlights and shadows, remasking things for the atmosphere to wrap around. That's just one of those moments where you go, am I really going to spend the entire day doing that so that this can be seen at an up angle? And in a lot of cases, you'll absolutely say yes, and then take a deep breath and dive into it. But in this case, considering you and I are the only ones who will ever see this, no, I'm going to go with no. On the upside, I think it does convey a lot of the things that I want it to, and I think the legibility is pretty on point. I did have to really work with the values because it mostly exists in these dark gray tones, but that's an intentional choice. It's intentionally low contrast in certain areas, which makes it feel a little camouflaged or hidden as a result. It's still legible, but it feels kind of obscured. It's sneaky or clandestine in a way, in keeping with the sort of ideas that I had originally rallied around. I like it. And I broke my pattern. I didn't make a garbage first image and then follow it with something simple that I really like. I feel like these first two frames are both good. Visually, they're also fairly complex, so I thought for the third frame, I'd add the additional constraint for myself of aiming for minimalism. Not only because these took several days each, surveillance took almost a week building all that detail from scratch, but in the previous challenges, the simpler compositions seemed to work out pretty well for me personally, and I thought that might just be the case here again, but I did have to stumble through a frame on the racing theme to clear my head enough to do that. This is apparently what stumbling looks like. I mean, good shot at trying to use some of these elements from the other round, and this could absolutely go somewhere, but you know what? My heart just wasn't really in it, and I found myself very much wanting to take on the architecture theme instead. I was thinking about the interplay of form and light in building interiors. And to me, that just seemed like much more fun, fertile ground for something minimal that I hadn't tried before. This is the first shot at that. It's just hand painting and masking in Photoshop. There's no 3D, and it's starting to get at what I was thinking, but not really. I like these hard value shifts and the more subtle value shifts within each of these sections, and the simple movement in the frame. You know, it's got something going for it, but it seems like this is more an impression of the sky than it is of architecture. The central focus of this image is just the wrong thing for me. So again, I moved on and made this. Now this is also hand painted, no 3D, and it's definitely more the impression of architecture I was shooting for. Just a sliver of light slashing through some solid forms and bouncing around doing what light does. Or at least my best approximation of what light does, which I learned to refine. A little more shadows in the corners, a subtle ray coming out here, a bit more apparent texture. This is really a minimalist impression of architecture that I can start to get behind. There really aren't any extraneous signifiers here. The elements are stripped to just form, light, and materials, and the frame is cropped in to focus on nothing but that. And compositionally, it seems to be covering the bases fairly well too, even as minimal as it is. There's a contrast in density, less going on here, more going on here, and with that, contrast in scale, as we discussed. although it helps to zoom way out to see why that is. At this size, you can see that the shapes are actually broken up into brighter and darker areas, and that's what really drives the image. And when you see that, obviously you can see these big shapes here and these smaller shapes going on here. At this size, your eyes don't even try to read it so much as walls or surfaces or even light and shadow. You can really just see the basic shapes created by values butting up against each other. As a stark black and white image, it's pretty apparent in this case, bright up against dark, small shape, big shape. And there's movement in it too, despite it being so simple. Lines converge here. This is where the eye is pulled. And it's free to wander, but inevitably it will come back here. I also added some really subtle shifts in color because light typically picks up color variation as it bounces off of surfaces. It's kind of nice to make something so minimal that you can really spend time on such subtle details. And when you make something minimal, the details are a lot more important because they're really the only thing there to look at. What that means, of course, is that the ideas that those minimal details convey better be interesting. There better be something the viewer can actually get out of them because there's not much to suss out visually. And in this case, maybe you'll agree, a minimal play of light and shadow on some clean surfaces? Yeah, that's not really going to hold the attention of too many people. It's a pretty simple example of the contrasts at play, but it doesn't convey an impression of architecture that most people are going to find compelling, even if I do on some level. Thankfully, what I realized after looking at this was that I think that without realizing it consciously, I was referencing the work of architect Tadao Ando. That was kind of my subconscious take on this whole theme, some half-formed memories of his extremely spare concrete constructions, and how they're really built to harness light in very precise ways. And I feel like doing a sort of poor man's version of his real-life structures isn't really all that interesting. So maybe this isn't where we land on the architecture theme. Instead, what if, just like before, what if we take some aspect of these ideas and combine it with something else? You know, something that adds a slightly more interesting flavor or spin, or possibly ends up creating something new. Hot dog. Hot dog plus bowl of chili. Chili dog. It's not really a hot dog and it's not really a bowl of chili. It's a whole different kind of gross thing. Actually, it's a really gross thing, and I kind of love it because I'm a gross human being. So, here's one thought amongst many possible thoughts. I still think there's something in Tadao Ando's work for me, and something that's apparent about a lot of his work is that it draws a lot from brutalism, which is really one of modernism's more severe and institutional descendants. Brutalism is very much about industrial materials like concrete crafted into hard, unadorned geometric spaces. It can be beautiful in a severe kind of way, but I think historically it seemed more like a very blunt statement about humanity's dominance over nature. It imposes itself on the environment around it in an unyielding way, kind of like an impenetrable fortress. Now, Ando invites light in, but in a very controlled way. He sculpts the light with concrete. So I thought, that being the case, what if we try our own combination of some of the general signifiers of this sort of brutalist architecture with something more natural? What if, we introduce some elements of nature, integrate them, or have them actually be welcomed in? So I worked on this for quite a while, pasting different elements together. Some concrete architecture, faking this glass, trying to make this lighting source feel sort of realistic. Really trying to make something where the natural elements are butting up against these hard concrete surfaces. And it does that well enough, but more importantly, I don't actually think that was really the idea I should have aimed for. The end result is more like a museum or a zoo where the natural elements are caged and on display. It's also kind of boring, right? I mean, it's not exactly an amazing composition, but mostly there's just not a whole lot going on that's interesting. Nothing's really happening. As always, it could evolve into something more interesting, but it would still be this nature in a cage take on the whole idea. So I put this one aside and took yet another crack at it, letting the natural elements run a little wild. And I think this really integrates the two and subverts that brutalist idea by letting the natural elements impose on the architecture stuff. Now, that's certainly nothing new, but it's still a take on the architecture theme that I'm interested in, and I think it works better to strip it back to just concrete, sand, and light, and to abstract the architecture to some simple forms. So it's not so much something like a specific hallway with walls and glass windows and stairs. It's just a little less about a certain place and more about a feeling or a mood, in the same way that this one has abstracted a lot of the elements to simply leave more of an impression than a representation of a place or a narrative told through specific actions. I mean, these kind of are places, but that's not really the focus because the details of those places have been abstracted just enough that the things that they start to suggest are maybe just a little more interesting than the idea that these are simple portraits of actual locations. So looking at these together, it's a little easier to see where the selection, reduction, and manipulation of signifiers works to refine and create a specific impression. And that's kind of a mouthful to say, but we talked last chapter about how abstracting the imagery in various ways can really be key to focusing and controlling the meaning, mood, and overall impression that you're conveying. And we also talked about a solid way to think about abstraction, which is to try to identify the various visual signifiers that your imagery contains or the language it naturally speaks, and to very selectively and consciously knock them out until what you have left is tightly focused on just what you intended. To be specific about the words you choose and how you use them, or to alter them letter by letter so they help you convey what you want. And maybe that's as apparent as changing the color of something. This is the same woman in the same lighting, in the same pose. But what's been removed on the right is the dark circles under the eyes, the blotches and pores on the skin. The colors of the skin and the lips have been shifted a little. The whites in the eyes are just slightly brighter. The eyelids are lightened and the eyelashes are darkened to set against them clearly. All this mostly through makeup, but it's really all shifts in color and value, right? But the two images convey two significantly different impressions of the same thing. Same woman, same pose, same lighting. Change some aspects of the skin, and suddenly one seems healthier, or less tired, or younger, or more seeking of attention, or, well, honestly, a lot of things. This is kind of a culturally loaded example. And hopefully it highlights something you already understand. But as always, the point is to be conscious of it so that you can both identify the important signifiers and add, modify, or remove them to nail it down to what you want. This or 1,000 other impressions. Seeing all these together, it's also easier to see how some abstraction strategies are used and where they're used well and where it's maybe a little sloppier. This one for sure is an abstraction through modification of the original values, but even more so through the scale of the elements involved. The scales are so obviously manipulated that you probably call this a surrealist piece overall, which is actually pretty popular in motion design. And of course, the abstracted film strip signifiers selectively spliced in there are pretty blatant too. This one is more of an attempt to be representative in its form, meaning no super obvious scale or color manipulations or anything like that. It's not surrealist. But this isn't a real surveillance camera, obviously. It's a mashup of bits of camera-like shapes with forms and qualities typically signifying machine or computer parts or whatever you want to call them. And that's an abstraction of the real things in all sorts of ways. It also incorporates some modified iconography, namely the Illuminati symbol, which of course is an abstraction. This isn't a representational or realistic image of the Illuminati. It's a symbol that stands in for it. This is probably the most obvious abstraction of the stuff that I made, if only because the results look more like the cliche minimalist abstract art that people are familiar with. Above all else, the strategy here is to reduce the signifiers as much as possible, to remove a lot of the identifiable details. In other words, I'm not about to put a wall clock or a hanging plant on one of these surfaces. I don't even want to indicate which way is up. Now, this one takes real architecture and manipulates it, bends and remixes existing representative imagery to focus more on the forms themselves. Overall, it tones down the sense of place and uses what's left to frame these new elements that have been brought in, which themselves are removed from their original context and recolored and relit. It feels like no place in particular as a result, so what's left is more of an impression than an actual unmanipulated photograph would probably be. And it's clearly easier to manage when there are fewer elements overall, but the scrutiny on those elements is higher in that case. So in minimalist stuff, dialing in the qualities of each element can take more time. But I think it gets interesting when you're really tearing apart and mixing signifiers to slip in ideas and references that may be more subconsciously perceived by your audience. Or when you mix things to go on to create something entirely new. Is this a film frame or is it not? Is this the Illuminati spying on you? It's not an absolute in either case. It's interpretive. As different as these are, they're similar in that strategy. Now, most of the time, having a basic goal already set kind of allows you to focus more on these sorts of strategies, more on how you're going to approach that goal from your angle and make it more interesting. Hopefully you found some themes that were just enough of a seed to get something started. That's really a big part of the point of the structure of that challenge. To get a little technical, what we did was to sort of establish the first step of the 5 steps of creation. Now, that's not a religious reference, it's just a more structured way to think about the process of making stuff that can be really helpful. We've talked about using working strategies like letting the form and function inform each other as you move forward, and how that can be really great in cases where you have to create your own goals or devise your own meanings, or tell stories that haven't really been settled on. Basically situations where you're the one coming up with visual concepts, so you have some real creative flexibility. But in a lot of cases, you may be hired onto a job where you have to figure out how to insert yourself into a workflow already in progress, where a team has already thought about and cemented some aspects of a project. So you have to figure out what you're looking at and the various gaps that are still left to fill. And the 5 steps can really help you break down and understand projects. Now, they're called steps, but for us, they're better thought of as layers, each built on top of the last. You can think of it like a body, if you like, with the skeleton establishing the basic shape and function, and then layers of muscle are attached to that to help it do the things it needs to do, and then nerves and vessels to support that. And then finally, skin on the surface, which is what you actually see with its various colors and values and textures and whatnot. But its shape really conforms to all the shapes and features underneath. And that's a nice blood and guts metaphor for the creative structure of a project from foundation to finishing. But what that really means is that the first step in any project is defining the purpose of it. Does your creature need to move real fast or fly from place to place or survive in an underwater cave? What's it need to do well with its time on the earth? You're deciding what you broadly want your project to accomplish or to communicate. This is what's generally defined for you in the case that you get a good creative brief. Now, emphasis on good, because a lot of clients may come to you with really scattered or even contradictory ideas about the purpose that the project should even serve. And they may get ahead of themselves and mix in all kinds of downstream or surface thoughts about color or fonts or whatever. You know the drill. They may have no experience with visual communication. They may just want to sell more refrigerators, which is the equivalent of saying, we want this creature to, survive. So you're going to have to do a bit of your own research in this phase to answer the more purpose-based questions like, is this meant to impart some information to the viewer? And if so, what? What are we trying to say about our client's brand? Or what does an audience really need to find out about this particular topic? The implied purpose embedded in various briefs can be anything in between super well defined and completely mysterious. So you're also going to be doing some degree of interpreting and filtering to really get to the purpose. In the style and strategy discussion, we talk a lot about sorting out the ideation processes of going from blank slate to finished work with a potentially really vague initial purpose. But here in the lab, we're really just focused on the making itself, and specifically on further empowering you to make good stuff consistently from your own perspective, from your own voice. So I provided some of the purpose. Give us your take on winter. Create an impression of wilderness. And that's somewhere between super well-defined and completely mysterious. I didn't say that it had to more specifically give people the feeling of being cozy next to a fireplace in a cabin in the snowy mountains of Colorado. Winter or downtown is just enough to let you know what territory to stay in while still letting you roam free. And your inclination to convey an impression of winter as a harrowing survivalist wasteland versus a magical frozen wonderland is you filling out that purpose. And once you have a pretty solid understanding of what needs to be accomplished in broad terms, you start coming up with concepts that address that. Back to our creature, if it needs to fly, wings would be a pretty good idea. If it's a climber, maybe it needs a functional tail. Maybe it's going to be a real jumper, so some jumpy legs would work. These are the important storytelling units that will help you get to the goal that you've established. So what kinds of metaphors do you want to employ to convey certain ideas? What sort of general imagery do you need to accomplish that? According to your take on winter, do you want to show a field of geometric shapes pulsing to music, or images of people dealing with an emergency, or is there something about the image of leaves spinning around in the eddies of a riverbank that seems metaphorically appropriate for what you need to convey? You're coming up with ideas for the general imagery that will convey the impression that you've decided on, but not exactly how the elements of that imagery will look. You're getting specific enough to say, it's a red rescue helicopter landing on a snowy mountaintop seen as if we're standing in the snow. Maybe because the audience needs to sense that there's an emergency in bad conditions. But you're not worried about fidgety details like how many wheels it has. Unless that's somehow really critical to what it means, like if the helicopter were clearly missing some landing gear. So this can be a real brainstorming phase, but most likely you're not actually making things yet. And then next you start looking at the structure. This is the shape that your story or argument or message will take in narrative form. The structure is the basics of the narrative itself. What happens first and second and third on the way to your audience having the full experience that you want them to, or understanding the things that you needed them to, or feeling a particular way. It's the arrangement in which you'll build the actual imagery that you started thinking about in the concept phase. Where are those wings going to go on this body? Should its giant teeth be on the outside, or should they reveal when shit gets real tense? Is it mostly ears, or is it mostly mouth? How are your elements situated to convey the actual beats and moments of the story? How do all these things come together into an intro and climax and resolution and everything in between? This is the point in a lot of projects at which you might make a rough storyboard of those images to figure out where they go and how and in what order. Or in a single image like what we've been concentrating on, you might instead do a rough sketch to show what goes where, to figure out how the elements come together to reveal information or how the story plays out in a single frame. Which elements are most important, or how the information is presented in a certain read order through the hierarchy of images or bits of information. And only now do you even get to craft, which describes the actual mediums in which that narrative structure is going to be conveyed, the ways in which those images are going to be crafted. You could tell this story using 1,000 possible techniques. So is it going to be live action or 3D or a particular kind of illustration or stop motion or VFX or puppetry? Every level of the decision-making process impacts what you're working toward and what you end up with, and this is clearly no different. Each medium will impact how your viewers feel and what they take away from it. Sometimes the choice seems obvious, like you want it to feel cartoony or you want something very real. So you make the choice to make a cartoon, or you make a choice to shoot it documentary style. Sometimes a certain medium just clearly makes sense given the intended purpose and the concepts you've come up with to achieve that purpose. And maybe it seems so obvious that you hardly spend any time at all thinking about the medium. That could be the case. But more often than not, a lot of people just default to the same kind of craft over and over. Like they're good with particle systems, so every project ends up being a 3D particle fiesta. Now, they may do that simply because it's what they're familiar with, or maybe working in that particular medium is the biggest reason that they want to do the work in the first place. And that's fair. But making an arbitrary choice here that's not in service to the purpose can really make the end result feel unconsidered and amateur. But when you've got a hammer in your hand, you tend to think about hammering things, regardless of what they are. So it pays to be able to make that choice knowingly instead of blindly, so you're as aware as possible of the impact a certain medium or craft will have in the end. And then finally, you can work out the exact aesthetics, the actual forms and images that end up on the screen. It's the skin and hairstyle and makeup and clothing on the skeleton. It's the surface features in all of their tiny, rad, gothy little details. The external appearance that you can break down into actual texture, line, value, color. The photos you've chosen and how you've treated them, or the illustrations, or the renders and how you've shaped them with modeling and materials and lighting and camera angles and so forth. It's the way you've shot or animated each little thing and how they're edited together. And that's really the whole hierarchy of it and how it plays out. Now, it's called the 5 steps of creation because it's pretty closely based on Scott McCloud's 6 steps from Understanding Comics, which might seem like a strange place to find such a universally helpful thing, but it's totally worth a read. And it does apply universally to pretty much every creative endeavor, so we're looking at a version more tailored for us. But right from the get-go, it's extra cool for us because it's coming from the world of comics, which is sequential visual storytelling. And of course, design for motion graphics and other kinds of filmmaking is essentially, yeah, you know what it is. It's sequential visual storytelling. They're called steps because in an ideal world, you'd start at the first step and move forward step by step, or build outward starting at the core with the purpose, and only move on to the concepts that advance that purpose once it's fully established. And so on out to the most finicky of visual details. And to the outside observer, that seems like how it works. Different skeletons meant for different purposes totally do result in hugely different varieties of downstream design choices, and you end up with completely different looking beasts. That is true. Although we know from going through the creative process many, many times that doing everything in perfect order, making creative decisions at each stage without ever wanting to go back and change them, is pretty rare. The creative process tends to be evolutionary. Like for the surveillance theme, in the concept phase of it, I decided to build a CCTV camera of some kind. But it was only after making a bunch of subsequent decisions about structure and craft and aesthetics that I realized that it should be seen at some sort of an up angle. Now, that doesn't mean I can't go back and redo it, but that's a huge pain in the ass. So it definitely does pay to start at the beginning and think about it from center outward as much as possible, because moving forward while you're on a shaky foundation can really be a recipe for pain. Now, you've undoubtedly heard some version of this before. I've heard all sorts, some garbled advice about creative workflow, or about setting creative goals, or maybe just the broad statement that concept is king. Related ideas for sure, but they kind of work better as sound bites and are usually more concerned with other endeavors like writing or something. This specific way of thinking about it is much more relevant to what we do. It's not mandatory, of course, but you can absolutely use it to prioritize your thinking when you start a project. so you don't get ahead of yourself thinking about render engines before you even have conceptual ideas, or getting obsessed with an image in your head before you really honestly have a firm grip on what you're trying to accomplish. But it's also great for situations where you enter into a project that other people have already been working on. Trying to understand a project's current state in these terms can really help you organize it mentally so you know what sorts of questions to ask first, so you know where the gaps and rough spots are, and then you can get on your way to helping refine those rough spots and being as valuable as possible to the team and the project. And maybe it would seem like this is a process that's at odds with the back and forth of the form and function strategy we've talked about. But it's really just a way to organize your understanding of a project and where it is in its development and where it needs to be. It doesn't keep you from being spontaneous or from letting an aesthetic choice give you ideas about the concepts or the structure or anything else. It just helps you prioritize and clarify. It basically helps you keep your shit on track. And something else that's interesting is that when looking at an image, this is the direction that viewers come from. They're presented with the surface, and they read that surface really quickly to uncover clues as to what it means. Conversely, this is more the direction artists and creators come from. There's something they want to get done, and they build it up to the surface. And as you know, you are both a viewer and an artist. So understanding this structure is twice as powerful for you. When you're a viewer, it can help you better break down and figure out what's making other people's cool stuff so cool and then learn from it. And when you're making, you can use it to help organize your ideas and sort out where the holes in those ideas are. Something we see happen all the time is that something really cool comes out and seemingly everyone is talking about it and is inspired by it for good reason. For those of us compelled to emulate that work, a few will have the capacity to see deeply into it and make comparably cool stuff. But many more of those people will just try to understand and emulate the more surface details, the aesthetics. And the shallower or spottier the understanding, the more amateur the results. We've all made crappy knockoffs. I've done it. I've probably done it a lot even when I knew better. Sometimes that fascination is powerful, and that's totally fine. That kind of emulation is a way to learn some surface things, although it's not a very good way to have a satisfyingly creative career. But what you're doing is developing some strategies to see more deeply into work that you're inspired by, so you'll be able to understand why it's so cool. And when making your own work, you'll have the tools for seeing the process holistically from conception to completion. The more you can work with this creative framework in mind, the greater your clarity of the art that you admire as a viewer, and the more you can really harness and wield your own ideas, author those ideas, and speak with your own voice. Those skills are super valuable for any size or type of project, but that value multiplies as the creative complexity of a project increases, which maybe not surprisingly, is exactly what's about to happen. This round, you're going to take a second look at the same 3 themes that you did for this past round. But you're going to choose 2 of those 3, whichever 2 you like, and you're going to do a totally different take on them by combining them with some new themes. This was my take on wilderness, with ideas about photography spun into it. This was an idea about surveillance, mixed with references to the Illuminati. This was an impression of architecture, but also of nature. In each case, I created some crossover point where the concepts had something to do with each other. A vision of wilderness, sure, but an interpretive, somehow photographic vision of wilderness. A symbol of surveillance with another symbol built into it as an implication of who is doing the surveilling. An architecture that imposes on its environment, reversed by having the environment impose on it. Whatever themes you picked, we're going to do the same in some way by combining them with one of these themes: food, murder, or the future. So I did wilderness, surveillance, and architecture. Let's say I choose to revisit wilderness and surveillance again. For the first, I could do something like wilderness in the future, whatever that means to me. Or murder in the wilderness. Or murder by wilderness. What could that mean? Would that be the aftermath of some violence in the jungle? Or would it be about one animal quietly stalking another? Maybe it's just some specifically chosen signifiers of a venomous snake. Maybe it's a scene with someone hopelessly lost in the desert, or of some dummy crawling into the lion exhibit at the zoo. The directions you take any of these combos are completely up to you. If I chose surveillance again, I could do future surveillance, although in a way, my version of surveillance is already kind of futuristic. And the point is to do a completely different take on two of the themes that we did before. So that probably wouldn't be a great idea unless I somehow saw it in a radically different way. Where it gets weird and potentially the most interesting and valuable is when you ask yourself to figure out something like surveillance crossed with food. What does that mean? Secret shoppers at the grocery store? Food that's being spied on? Spy food? Foods that are spies? If you figure out what that means to you, you're probably going to end up with something no one's really seen. And in a world of endless stylistic clones and knockoffs, that could actually be a uniquely memorable piece. Now, if you have a hard time figuring out what the future of arson is or how to make playground food interesting, just know that that's actually a cool part of the challenge on this one, so stick to it. Getting past the blank page is a topic we explored in much more depth in Style and Strategy, if you need to refer back to that. But brainstorm, sit on the problem, work back and forth between form and function, figure out which layers of this hierarchy are lacking or you're stumbling over at any given moment. Do whatever you think is helpful, just stay on it until you find a really interesting way to convey your impression of that thing. Part of it is in how you interpret what that combination means, and then in how you realize that interpretation. Either of those may not come to you immediately. That's fine. First ideas usually aren't all that interesting anyway, so let yourself be challenged and let those ideas evolve. Use the 5 steps framework to build your ideas up to actual imagery, and when you get to making something, keep those contrasts in mind. We've talked about a ton of useful stuff at this point, so make use of as much of it as you can. And as always, do more frames if you want. I'm going to start thinking about mine, and I'll see you when you're done. Enjoy!